There comes a moment in everyone's life, a true awakening, when they perceive something deeply unsettling. They look around and notice that people who always seem to be fixtures in their lives have begun to fade away. There's no dramatic fight, no explosive argument. They simply drift out of the picture, and in the deafening silence of their absence, a question arises. A question that few dare to voice aloud. Did I do something wrong? Eckhart Tolle has spent years meticulously observing this phenomenon, and what he's uncovered goes against everything you've been taught about relationships. The truth is, when you awaken, you don't lose people. You discover who was never really there to begin with. And today, I'm going to reveal the 5 types of people who inevitably disappear from your life after this awakening. But more than that, I'm going to show you why each of these departures, as painful as they may seem, is actually the universe, clearing space for something your old self could never have received. Before we continue, I need you to understand something fundamental. Eckhart Tolle explains that before the awakening, you don't have a relationship with your personality. You are your personality. There is no separation. What you think is you is just a jumbled mess of conditioned patterns, inherited beliefs, and social masks that you've worn to survive. But the moment consciousness begins to emerge, and something extraordinary happens. You start to observe these patterns. You realize that there's a space between you and your thoughts, and in that space, in that gap of awareness, resides the truth about who you really are. And here's the problem that no one mentions. When you change your frequency, when you start to operate from a different level of consciousness, the people around you feel it. They can't explain what's changed. They can't put it into words. But something in them recognizes that you're no longer the person they knew. And that's scary, deeply scary, because your silent transformation functions like a mirror, and there are people who simply can't bear to see their own reflection. The first type of person who disappears from your life after the awakening is what I call the ego validator. This person was drawn to you for a very specific reason. You shared the same insecurities, the same fears, the same complaints about life. Together, you created a zone of mutual comfort where it was permitted to remain small, to remain a victim, to continue blaming the external world for internal problems. Eckhart Tolle describes this as a relationship based on the pain body. 2 pain bodies feeding each other, each validating the other's suffering. But when you awaken, something changes. You stop feeding that cycle. You stop participating in the complaint sessions. You stop agreeing when the person says that life is unfair, that the world is against them, that nothing ever works out, and that's absolutely unacceptable to the other person's ego, because your simple presence, your silence in the face of complaints, your refusal to validate the victim role, all of this sends a silent message that says, there is another way to live. And for those still trapped in the ego, that message is an existential threat. So the person withdraws, sometimes with vague excuses, sometimes with accusations. You've changed. You think you're better than others. You're not fun anymore, but the truth that they'll never admit is that your light has become unbearable for those who choose to remain in the darkness. The second type is the friend of convenience. This is perhaps the most painful to lose because the relationship seemed genuine. You hung out together, shared moments, laughed at the same things, but there was something that you didn't realize yet until you awakened. The basis of this friendship wasn't true connection, it was social function. You were friends because you frequented the same places, because you worked together, because you had the same hobbies, because it made logical sense and to be friends with that person. Eckhart Tolle talks about how the ego creates transactional relationships. I give you this, you give me that. I validate your identity, you validate mine, and as long as that exchange remains balanced, the relationship works, but the awakening breaks that equation because you stop needing external validation, you stop needing someone to confirm who you are, you stop doing things that don't resonate with your truth, just to maintain social appearances. And when that happens, the friend of convenience gets confused. Why don't you want to go to those places anymore? Why don't you care about the things that you used to do together? Why do you seem so different? The answer is simple, but devastating to the ego. You've discovered that you can exist and without this relationship. You've discovered that your identity doesn't depend on belonging to that group, on being part of that dynamic. And for someone whose identity is still completely merged with their social relationships, that's incomprehensible. It's threatening. So, the person withdraws, not out of malice, but out of ego self-preservation. Your awakened presence has become a constant reminder that there's something beyond the superficial exchanges, and that something is terrifying for those who aren't ready to face it. Now I need to pause here, and because what I'm about to reveal about the third type completely changes the way you see your most intimate relationships. The third type of person who disappears is the energy vampire. Now, but I'm not talking about vampires in the dramatic way that popular culture presents. I'm talking about something much more subtle and therefore much more dangerous. This type of person has developed an unconscious pattern of feeding on the emotional energy of others. They may seem like the kindest person in the world. They may be caring. They may be helpful, but there's always a hidden price. Eckhart Tolle explains that the pain body, this energetic entity formed by accumulated suffering, needs nourishment to survive, and it feeds on drama, on conflict, on negative emotions. The energy vampire is someone whose pain-bodied has learned to provoke these emotions in others, not necessarily consciously, but extremely effectively. Have you ever had that experience of spending time with someone and then feeling completely exhausted afterward, drained of energy, as if something had been sucked out of you? That's not imagination. That's the other person's pain body, the feeding on yours. But here's what changes after the awakening. When you develop presence, when you start to inhabit the present moment, for real, you stop producing the kind of energy that the vampire needs. Drama requires identification with thoughts, requires emotional reactivity, requires you to be dragged into mental narratives. But presence dissolves all of that. You can still feel emotions and you can still have thoughts, but they pass through you. So instead of consuming you, you become like the sky that watches the clouds drift by without becoming entangled with them. And this renders you completely useless as a food source for the energy vampire. So, what happens? The person instinctively pulls away. They go looking for nourishment elsewhere. They'll find someone whose pain body is still reactive and available to be exploited, and you are free, perhaps a little confused as to why that relationship that seemed so intense simply evaporated. But free. And here's something that few realize about energy vampires. They aren't bad people. They aren't villains. They are hurt people who've developed a survival mechanism based on absorbing energy from others. Most don't even know they're doing it, but that doesn't mean you should continue being a food source. Your awakening doesn't obligate you to sacrifice your energy to help someone who doesn't want to help themselves. Compassion doesn't mean self-sabotage. The fourth type is the one that confuses people who awaken the most. It's the family member, trapped in their role. Your family doesn't know you. Your family knows a role that you've played your whole life to survive within that dynamic. You might have been the responsible one, the rebel, the invisible one, the mediator, the problem child, the perfect one. It doesn't matter what role it was. What matters is that your family built an entire structure of identity around that role. And when you awaken and start to step out of it, that structure starts to shake. Eckhart Tolle talks about how the collective ego of a family works. Each member has a specific function to keep the system operating, and any attempt at change is perceived as a threat to the survival of the whole. This explains why the most sincere attempts to share your awakening with family members often result in fierce resistance. You haven't changed for them. You've betrayed them. You've abandoned your role. You've jeopardized the stability of the entire system. Some family members will try to pull you back into the old role. They'll use guilt. They'll use emotional manipulation. They'll use those classic lines. You weren't always like this. What happened to you? Since when do you think you're superior? And when they realize you aren't going back, many will simply walk away. This is particularly painful because we carry a deep belief that family is forever, that blood is thicker than water, that no matter what happens, family will be there. But Eckhart Tolle reminds us of a difficult truth. True love doesn't require you to diminish yourself. True love doesn't need you to remain unconscious in order to be accepted. True love celebrates your expansion instead of fearing it. And if a family relationship can't offer that, then what existed wasn't love. It was dependence. It was custom. It was an unwritten contract. That said, I accept you as long as you remain predictable. And you can't be predictable anymore. You can't fit into boxes anymore that were built for a version of you that no longer exists. Now we come to the fifth and final type. And this one is the most surprising of all. The fifth type of person who disappears from your life after awakening is yourself, or rather, the version of yourself that you thought you were. Eckhart Tolle says that the ego is a false identity created by the mind. It's a collection of stories about who you are, where you came from, what you've suffered, what you've achieved, what you deserve. But none of those stories are you. They're just thoughts, neural patterns, memory combined with imagination. And when you awaken, that false identity begins to die. This is what many call ego death. And it's not a pleasant experience. You may feel like you're losing yourself, like everything you've built is crumbling, like you don't know anymore who you are or why you're here. And in that confusion, in that unfamiliar territory now, many of the people around you don't know how to deal with you because they also don't know who you are now. They related to a mask, to a character, to a role. And now that the mask is falling, they don't recognize the face beneath it. Some will leave because they can't handle the uncertainty. Others will leave because the mask was what they loved, not you. And that hurts. It hurts deeply. But here's the paradox that Eckhart Tolle reveals, and that changes everything. By losing who you thought you were, you finally find who you really are. By losing the relationships based on illusion, you open space for connections based on truth. By letting go of the people who needed your unconsciousness, you attract those who celebrate your light. And that brings us to the question that maybe you've been asking yourself since the beginning of this video. What do you do when everyone seems to be leaving? First, it's essential to understand that you're not doing anything wrong. What's happening isn't punishment. It isn't negative karma. It isn't the universe abandoning you. It's the exact opposite. Eckhart Tolle uses a powerful metaphor. He says that when you raise your vibrational frequency, when you begin to live on a different level of consciousness, you naturally fall out of tune with everything that vibrates at lower frequencies. Think of a radio. When you change the station, you no longer hear what was playing before. Not because that station ceased to exist, but because you are no longer tuned to it. The same happens with people. Those who remain in states of unconsciousness, those whose ego still completely dominates their life experience, simply can't pick you up anymore. You're out of their range, and that's necessary, that's healthy, and that's part of the process. Second, you need to allow yourself to experience grief. Yes, even if these departures are liberating, they are still losses, and losses need to be mourned. Don't suppress the sadness. That arises when a friend of years stops answering your messages. Don't pretend it doesn't hurt. When a family member treats you like a stranger. Don't force a false positivity, telling yourself that everything is fine. Eckhart Tolle emphasizes that true presence includes the ability to be with difficult emotions without trying to escape them. You can be completely present while the sadness passes through you. You can observe the pain without completely identifying with it. The difference between an awakened person and an asleep person isn't that the awakened person doesn't feel. The difference is that the awakened person doesn't get lost in what they feel. So let the sadness come. Let the tears fall, if they need to fall. Let the heart ache as much as it needs to ache. But while you do that, maintain a fragment of consciousness at observing. That fragment is your anchor. It's your safe harbor, and that part of you that knows this too shall pass. Third, and this might be controversial, you need to stop trying to save the people who are leaving. I know. When you awaken, there's this huge urge to share. You want everyone to see what you're seeing. You want everyone to feel what you're feeling. You want to shake people and shout, "Look at the truth," and right in front of you. But it doesn't work that way. Eckhart Tolle says, you can't awaken another person. Awakening is an internal event, a spontaneous one. That happens when someone's consciousness is ready. No amount of arguing, explaining, or demonstrating can force that process. When you try to convince someone who's leaving that they should stay, that they should understand, that they should change along with you, what you're really doing, Swan, is clinging to a version of the past. You're saying to the universe, I know I'm changing, but I don't want to lose what I had. And the universe doesn't work like that. The new version of you can't carry the baggage of the old version. Something needs to be left behind, and sometimes that something is people. Let them go. With love, with gratitude for what was, but let them go. Fourth, trust that the empty space will be filled. This is perhaps the most difficult step because it requires faith in something you can't yet see. When people start leaving your life, you might feel an enormous void. It might feel like you're becoming alone in the world. It might feel like no one else will understand you, that you'll never find true connection again. But Eckhart Tolle reminds us of a universal law that never fails. Like attracts like. When you elevate your consciousness, you inevitably attract other elevated consciousnesses. Not in a forced way, not in a way where you need to go searching, but in an organic, natural, almost magical way. The right people will cross your path. They'll show up in unexpected places. They'll reveal themselves at perfect moments, and the quality of these new connections will be completely different from what you had before. Because now, you're no longer seeking someone to complete you. You're no longer looking for external validation. You're no longer trying to fill an internal void with an external presence. You are whole, and when two whole beings meet, what arises isn't dependence, it's celebration, it's mutual expansion, it's true love. Now, let me tell you something Eckhart Tolle revealed that few truly understand. There's a fundamental difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is a state of lack. It's feeling incomplete because you're alone. It's the sensation that something is missing, that you need another person to be whole. Solitude is completely different. Solitude is the ability to be with yourself and feel at peace. It's finding completeness in your own presence. It's discovering that within you, there's an inexhaustible source of love, of joy, satisfaction. Most people have never experienced true solitude. They confuse being alone with being incomplete. They flee from themselves through relationships, through entertainment, through anything that fills the internal silence. But awakening offers you something rare. It offers you the opportunity to discover that you've never really been alone, because the consciousness that inhabits you is the same consciousness that inhabits the entire universe. You are an individual expression of something infinite. And when you truly understand that, the departure of people ceases to be tragedy. It becomes transition, evolution, the natural movement of life, reorganizing to better serve your expansion. There's something else I need to share before we continue, and it's something Eckhart Tolle explained in one of his lesser-known talks. He said that awakening isn't an event, it's a continuous process. It's a death and a rebirth that happens repeatedly, and each cycle, each layer that you go through, brings with it new departures. That means that even after you've lost certain people, you can go through another cycle of awakening and lose even more. And here's the part that most avoid talking about. The more you awaken, the more selective becomes the circle of people who can remain around you, not out of arrogance, not out of judgment, but simply because your vibrational frequency becomes increasingly refined. Think of a musical instrument being tuned. The more precise the tuning, the less other instruments can harmonize with it. This isn't a defect of the instrument. It's a natural consequence of its purity. You are being tuned. And some people simply can't play in the same frequency anymore. Before we conclude, I want to give you 5 signs that the right people are arriving in your life. First sign, you feel lighter after being with them, not heavier. Their presence doesn't drain your energy. On the contrary, it seems to amplify it. You leave the encounters feeling more alive, more inspired, more connected to yourself. Second sign, there's no need to explain your awakening. These people simply understand. Maybe they're on similar journeys. Maybe they have a natural openness to the mystery. But you don't need to convince anyone of anything. The understanding is immediate and silent. Third sign, the silence is comfortable. You can be together without the need to fill every moment with conversation. The silence between you isn't awkward. It's nourishing. It's a form of communication in itself. Fourth sign, they celebrate your growth instead of fearing it. When you share a discovery, an insight, a change, these people don't feel threatened. They feel inspired. Your growth doesn't diminish their identity. It expands their vision of what's possible. Fifth sign, the relationship flows without dramatic effort. There are no games. There's no manipulation. There's no need to be constantly proving something. The connection exists because it exists, not because it's being forced or maintained artificially. Now, after everything I've revealed today, something needs to be absolutely clear. If you're going through this process of seeing people leaving your life, if you're experiencing the pain of transformation, if you're wondering why awakening seems to be leaving you more alone, understand this: you are not alone. Millions of people around the world are going through exactly the same thing right now. There's a wave of collective awakening happening, and you're part of it. And each person who leaves your life is creating space for more aligned, more true, more transforming connections. Eckhart Tolle once said that the greatest spiritual achievement is the complete dissolution of the feeling of separation. And ironically, that dissolution often begins with what feels like the greatest separation, the departure of people you loved. But in the end, you discover you were never separate from anything. You discover that the consciousness that looks through your eyes is the same consciousness that looks through everyone's eyes. You discover that true love cannot be lost, because it is the very substance of what you are. If this video resonated with you, if it put words to experiences you didn't know how to describe, please consider clicking the super thanks button. It helps me continue bringing you content like this, content that most channels wouldn't dare to touch, because it demands vulnerability and truth. You're not just another viewer. You're a seeker, and seekers recognize when they've found something real. Now, a simple practice for the next few days. Each time the pain of departure arises, each time you feel the absence of someone who's gone, do this. Stop, breathe, and ask yourself, who in me is feeling this pain? You'll discover that there is the suffering, and there is the one who observes the suffering, and that observer, that silent presence, never suffers. It merely witnesses. The more you inhabit that observing presence, the more you'll realize that people may come and go, but that which you truly are remains untouched, remains complete, remains in peace. Now tell me, which of these 5 types of people has disappeared from your life? Type 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? I read all the comments in the first few hours and respond to as many as I can. Be honest about which departure hurt the most, because in honesty, there is healing. And remember, the space that remains when someone leaves isn't empty. It's possibility. It's potential. It's the universe preparing something that your old self could never have received until the next awakening. The consciousness that you are doesn't need anyone to be complete. It already is, always was, and always will be.